But man, today we're not talking about pirates of fiction. We are talking about a pirate of history. And yet, one history that is surrounded and shrouded in mystery, fantasy, and lore within itself. We are talking about the pirate. When you average Joe on the street think pirate, the one that comes to mind, I would argue the one pirate whose name, or at least one of his names, is known by every single individual, regardless of how interested you are in pirate lore or otherwise. That's right. We're talking about the Kal-El of the Justice League, the top tier, the one, the Rock. I'm talking about Blackbeard.
We all have heard of Blackbeard.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's certainly in Western civilization, like or at least the English-speaking world. Like we know when we think of piracy, certainly during the Golden Age of Piracy in that time period, like we don't even know who he is, but we know the name Blackbeard.
Absolutely,
we know the name
Blackbeard. So it's interesting because when we started the Pirates and Pipe Tobacco series years ago, I intentionally did not do Blackbeard because there's kind of like a low-hanging fruit nature of that.
Yeah, sure.
Everybody knows who Blackbeard is. And yet there's a lot of stories about Blackbeard.
Blackbeard was the basic white girl of
He's a pumpkin
piracy.
Spice
He's
latte.
the pumpkin spice latte of the pirate world. He's wearing his Ugg boots and
how dare you? How dare you? But you're not totally incorrect from a certain point of view.
It's fantastic.
But no, I mean it's the name that everybody knows.
To the manager.
You take that DK. Well, actually that's a joke in the future. Never mind. Anyway, point is, man, we were talking about Blackbeard. Now, like I said, I intentionally kind of saved him. I knew I wanted to talk about him during a special occasion with this kind of promotion with the findeversale.com and the Pirate's Daughter. It was the perfect time to do so. And so here we are talking about Edward Teach, or is it Edward Thatch? Because right off the bat, the mystery around Blackbeard kind of begins with some of the misinformation that surrounds who was Blackbeard.
Gosh, these pirates have a lot of that element to all their stories.
Absolutely.
These are real historical characters that can be verified by official documents.
Yes.
And yet there's so much mystery.
Well, and you got to think about it. We live in a digital age where all of that stuff is backed up and stored and in databases and everything else. And so finding somebody's identity is relatively easy, relatively quick. Even you look on Netflix and you see all of these Tinder swindler and all of these documentaries on these individuals who recreates their identity. And yet you can still track them, even casual people who have been spurned can track them on Google and get to the bottom of it.
Sure. Yeah.
This was not the case for, Edward Teach's day or Edward Thatch. Again, it is highly contested. You have people that swear by the notion that his name was Thatch because of documents that exist referencing Edward Thatch. But then you also have those that swear that it was Teach because of documents that listed him as Teach.
So he had different names, and I guess they have enough confidence to know that this is the same person.
Enough confidence to know it's the same person. There's enough kind of information that kind of congeal around him to the point where, and this is where we're going to fall into the allegedly portion of his history.
Yeah.
Because there is kind of this piecing together from what we know of Teach/Thatch of the Edward variety.
Can we pick one this episode?
I would like to go with Teach, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's good.
Interestingly enough, Thatch was the first one that I was introduced to as a kid because in Disney's Blackbeard's Ghost.
Is that the name they used?
Yeah, they used Thatch and they referred to him as Thatch. And then later, when I heard him referred to as Teach in a different media, I was super confused.
Yeah.
And therein lies the point. But yes, for the purpose of this podcast,
Edward Teach.
Edward Teach is the one that we're going with, a.k.a. Blackbeard. He was born in the late 1600s, early 1700s, as many in his fraternity were. Approximately Bristol is where he is kind of placed to a wealthy family. However, he gave up his family fortune to his mother and his sister when his father died, and he went off to fight in the War of Spanish Succession as a privateer.
Wow.
Now we talked.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, we talked about privateers before. These are kind of they're like sanctioned. They're like government sanctioned pirates, essentially.
Yeah.
Hired guns, if you will. That kind of thing. But he did so out the gate, as opposed to some of the other individuals we've talked about
had spent some time in the military or the Navy or something.
Exactly. Or
were former pirates that had been forgiven and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That was not necessarily his case. So he was actually a privateer until he came under the command of one Benjamin Hornigold. Now, longtime listeners of Country Squire Radio may recall Benjamin Hornigold was, I want to say, the second Pirates and Pipe Tobacco episode we ever did.
Yep.
Hornigold is kind of one of these OGs. Like literally, Blackbeard was second in command to this guy. He was the man that kind of trained Blackbeard. And Blackbeard served under him, not in the Spanish War of Succession, but specifically as a pirate, and kind of entered into piracy in that way. This was in 1717. All right. So they're going around, they're doing their thing, their pirate things. They're already kind of in kind of a top tier recognizable group sailing with Benjamin Hornigold. Blackbeard comes across another pirate, the gentleman pirate, Steve Bonnet. All right. Have you ever heard of Steve Bonnet before?
I don't think we've discussed him.
We have not discussed him. We have.
It's been very brief. Yeah.
Much like how a lot of different pirates popped up in the Calico Jack episode.
Yeah.
Blackbeard has a lot of individuals that surround him. The difference is, unlike Calico Jack, Blackbeard was BA. He was like, he knew what he was doing. Right. Unlike, by the way, Steve Bonnet. So Steve Bonnet was called the gentleman pirate because this dude just was kind of like a pirate fanboy. He wanted to be a pirate, but like he didn't want to make his mama mad. You understand what I'm saying? So what this dude did is he went around and he found a bunch of ne'er-do-wells, and he did something that wasn't often the case in piracy. He paid them a salary. Wow. And he's like, sail with me under my pirate flag, and we will go around being swashbucklers, don't you know? And, and he paid them a salary because, he wasn't very good at taking prizes. He wasn't very good at the whole piracy thing.
That's wild.
But he just really wanted to be a pirate. So lo and behold.
Was he the Paris Hilton of pirates? Like he actually can't do anything, but he has a lot of people that follows him that he basically pays? Something
like that. I mean, I think for him, he's more of like a fancy boy who's from like, a rich family.
A dandy.
And, like a certain individual that you and I were kind of talking about recently who's kind of like, comes from money, goes around kind of like, as if this is his life, but it's not really his life.
Right.
But the difference is this one wanted to go out and set sail. But again, he didn't want to make his mama mad. So he did pay all of these individuals to do all the rough work for him. Lo and behold, what does he do? He just so happens to come across one of the most notorious up and coming pirates of his era, Blackbeard, who comes on, takes his ship essentially and says, all right, you're sailing with me in Hornigold now. And how about I be the captain and you no longer be the captain?
Right.
And Steve's like, well, how dare you? I mean, after all, I wanted to be the captain, but I guess I could learn under you, Blackbeard. That would be amazing. And the crew was all like, oh my gosh, yes, please. Can we get a captain that knows what he's
doing? Kick Mr. Dandy out of here.
Instantly, Bonnet's ship, the Revenge, becomes an extremely successful pirate vessel.
Interesting.
They take upwards of like 15 ships in the matter of just a few months, all off the coast off the American coast. And this is where we really see Captain Blackbeard, or Captain Teach essentially, really come into his own as a pirate. Now, it's worth noting that in like modern culture, there's a very popular show right now called Our Flag Means Death that has reimagined the Blackbeard-Bonnet relationship more as like a romantic relationship.
Of course.
That's not the way it was. Blackbeard was kind of like a notorious womanizer, which isn't a good thing, but I mean, that's just historically accurate.
Right, sure.
But at the same time, is he a womanizer if he keeps on marrying these women? I mean, like, yeah, it actually does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Blackbeard notoriously had several wives over the course of a very short amount of time.
Okay.
So, he'd go from port to port, but I mean, like, he'd get married, he'd make it legal, and then he'd, bounce and make it legal somewhere else.
Wow.
Yeah, this was his way. Anyway, so they go around. He's very successful at this point and is coming across what is going to famously be his largest prize, which was the La Concorde, which was a French slaving ship, which he took, outfitted with 40 guns, and renamed as the Queen Anne's Revenge.
Oh, wow.
Now, this was already a large French vessel. And this is kind of interesting for Blackbeard because he historically kind of went after Spanish ships more so than French ships.
Yeah, sure.
But man, this was a big one. Like, this is one of the largest ships that he had ever come across.
This is a big catch.
One of the biggest ones that any pirate had ever kind of come across and successfully captured. And to fit it out with 40 guns, we're now talking about essentially a floating fortress. The Queen Anne's Revenge is probably the most famous pirate ship of all other pirate ships.
What a great
It's fantastic. Of course, referencing his time in the War of Spanish Succession and everything.
Sure.
So the Queen Anne's Revenge became this extremely notable ship throughout the Gulf of Mexico, where the Spanish started giving him the name El Grande Diablo. So not only was he going under Captain Teach and occasionally Blackbeard, but El Grande Diablo.
Like the giant devil.
Well, and we'll talk about it kind of as we get to the end, but I mean, like Blackbeard was aware of the importance of narrative and like presentation. He was as much a brand enthusiast, if you will, a marketer.
He cultivated.
He really understood that you were what you were perceived to be more so than you actually are.
That's true.
It's interesting because
Certainly, in the eyes of other people. Yeah.
There's conflicting narratives around Blackbeard historically. Some paint him to be a tyrant, and I'll explain that a little bit later. And then some kind of point out, like, in the vast majority of his time as a pirate, they didn't really murder anybody. They didn't take prisoners or anything of that nature. There wasn't he wasn't this butcherer that he's sometimes portrayed to be.
Right.
And to some extent, that may be because he was so good at communicating this narrative of a fearful individual, maybe even larger than life, maybe even demonic, speaking into this El Grande Diablo.
And then people just followed him.
And people followed. When you are able to strike fear, you no longer have to spend blood to take a prize.
Sure.
Because if they're afraid of what you could do, they'll just go ahead and give it to you without you having to do anything.
Wow.
And so he was a genius in many regards. He was a tactical genius in the way that he was able to take ships, but he was also a genius in the way that he was able to let his narrative and name precede him so that he could avoid unnecessary battle whenever possible and yet still take some sizable prizes. South Carolina, one of the largest and kind of most notable points in his career.
Yeah.
He holds, well, okay, let's just put it this way. So I mentioned, he doesn't really take prisoners, but let's just say that he did take a hostage.
Okay.
A notable hostage, a city hostage. He held an entire city hostage for 6 days.
Wow.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the Queen's Anne's Revenge is essentially like this massive floating fortress. He parks it outside the city, stops all trade in and out. And what he's demanding of the city, which, by the way, this doesn't happen all that often, right? Like typically you're taking prizes on the seas. And as we talked about with Rackham, if you do something in front of a city, that's typically in game. They're going to like, we know where you're at. You're right there. We can send all of our stuff.
We'll just come get you.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. No, this wasn't Blackbeard. Nobody was willing to challenge the Queen Anne's Revenge to get any close to it. 40 cannons. Boom, 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 boom.
That is
You're
crazy.
dead before you get an entire shot off.
Right.
And so he's got cannons facing the sea. He's got cannons facing the city. He's holding the city hostage for 6 days because he's not after gold. He's not after money. He's after medical supplies. One of the things that pirates had to face constantly was the threat of,
disease,
dying. You're literally traveling all over the place. Exactly. And so he was holding him hostage for medical supplies. And again, I think this also shows that he's a forward-thinking individual in his era, that he is not just looking for the payday, he's also looking for sustainability, like literally life-sustaining in himself and in his crew as they kind of go along. So this adventure of holding the city hostage for 6 days began to ruffle some jimmies, if you will, for one Steve Bonnet on his crew, who's like, oh my, Mama is not going to be very pleased with the fact that I held an entire city hostage. Perhaps it's time that we part ways, Blackbeard. Blackbeard, who's like, oh, you're still here? Is kind of like, yeah, man, this has been fun. That's cool. Hey, thanks for, giving me money for no apparent reason. Sure, go. By the way, you're probably not going to last long without me around, but
right.
Good luck with that. And of course, Steve Bonnet was captured and put on trial and hung 4 months later.
Wow.
Now, I want to stop here for a second, because Steve Bonnet is a very interesting character by contrast to Blackbeard.
Yeah.
Theoretically, these were both individuals that came from some kind of like wealth and establishment and money and, privilege and prominence of some sort, right? But the difference is that Blackbeard kind of gave that all off and like kind of found his own way.
And Bonnet wanted to have both.
He wanted to have both.
Right.
And that was a very threatening narrative to the establishment, to the civilized world, that there was somebody who thought that they could have both, that they could be this kind of out there like criminal, but still maintain some sort of genteel nature to them.
Respected by society and maintain that upward mobility and all that kind of stuff.
Massive threat to the establishment. Massive threat
I never really
to
thought about that.
society. In A General History of Pirates, which is, of course, Charles Johnson's book, Captain Charles, quote unquote, Captain Charles Johnson's book.
Yeah.
When he goes into Bonnet's history, one of the majority of the chapter on Steve Bonnet goes to his trial. And it's specifically going into how the courts hammered into him, not just the fact that he committed these crimes, but also the fact that he did this as an abomination to God. Because as somebody who is a civilized individual from like prim and proper, plantation, good, quote unquote, good plantation owning people. How dare you offend God this way? So I have to read this. This is the Lord Chief Justice's speech upon his proclamation sentence of Major Stede Bonnet. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to read some of this. Major Stede Bonnet, you stand here convicted upon 2 indictments of piracy, one by the verdict of jury, and the other by your own confession. You know that the crimes you have committed are evil in themselves and contrary to the light and the law of nature, as well as the law of God, by which you are commanded that you shall not steal, Exodus 20:15. And the apostle St. Paul expressly affirms that thieves shall not inherit the kingdom of God, 1 Corinthians 6:10. But the theft, you have added a greater sin, which is murder. How many have you killed of those that resisted you in commenting on your former piracies? I know not. But this we all know, that besides the wounded, you killed no less than 18 persons out of those that were sent by lawful authority to suppress you and put a stop to those rapnions as you daily acted. There's a lot of like old English words in here that I don't really recognize.
I'm eating this up.
Thing is, so they go through, and I can't even count the number of scripture that is referenced throughout this aggressive speech against him.
And this is the jurist speaking.
This is the Lord Chief Justice.
Okay, yeah.
Like, for example, he says, for it is the voice of nature confirmed by the law of God that whoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Genesis 9:6. He's like straight up trying to Jesus juke this. Like he's like literally putting like the verses in as he's like going after him. Like, he quotes Revelations, he quotes Psalms, he quotes Corinthians.
That's amazing.
It's like, it's like all over the map. He's like hammering in, and it's not just to like make Stede Bonnet, who's probably wetting himself right now because Mama is very, very displeased with him at this point. But it's also to send a message to the civilized world that you cannot do this. You cannot exist as a pirate and be, considered civilized. And so I just think it's fascinating, again, that this character is so intertwined with Blackbeard, who himself was kind of seen as the devil. Like, so you have this Stede Bonnet who was corrupted by the devil in this, civilized portrayal of their time together.
To me, it just seems like a very unwitting accomplice to Blackbeard. And then, of course, when you have this grandiose speech that this official is making.
Oh, and it goes on. I can't read it all, but yeah.
but it's really amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's like you can just picture this person like kind of already looking over towards the gallows. I mean, just like, okay, I'm out. I'm done with this thing. Yeah.
So it's
really fascinating.
So thus the end of Stede Bonnet. But meanwhile, Blackbeard is doing quite well for himself because he's a pretty good at being a pirate here. That being said, we've talked about, of course, about our boy Woodes Rogers and what his whole tactics were and everything else. And it's interesting because I've talked about how Woodes Rogers and the Pardon was wildly successful at ending piracy. And yet it also has these scragglers, right? These people that took the Pardon, but then did they? And Blackbeard finds himself now thinking like, okay, this Pardon is going on right here. We've been having some fun off the coast of South Carolina. That was pretty awesome. He's like, hey, I got an idea. Everybody, y'all want to like retire for a bit? And I was like, yeah, I mean, we can retire for a bit. We're doing pretty good. We've got a lot of prizes. We got a lot of money. It's like, okay, cool. In North Carolina, there's the city of Bath. I think we get washed up there, but I'm not entirely sure what they're doing with it. Why don't we go? It's kind of a small town. By the way, the governor there, we've been kind of writing each other, and he's going to hook us up. I'm just saying we're going to be okay. And so they go in, the governor pardons Blackbeard, his entire crew, and his entire crew kind of add to the population of Bath. This is something that even to this day, North Carolina and that area is very, they celebrate Blackbeard.
They kind of celebrate this.
Absolutely.
Wow, I was unaware of this. Interesting.
Meanwhile, Blackbeard does set up a camp on kind of like a little island outside of Bath where he continues to find different items while he's out at sea.
He just finds them.
Yeah, it's like Blackbeard, hey buddy, what you doing? Nothing. I'm just chilling. Okay, it looks like you're chilling with like a whole bunch of bushels of sugar that we haven't seen you with before. It's like, oh yeah, these, I just found them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just found him.
You're not using that boat for anything, are you?
It's like, oh, okay. That's the other thing too. You got to think about it. Like Blackbeard like having a ship outside your port,
as
kind of some protection. I mean, it was a good deal.
It's a good arrangement.
And that's the thing. When it's like, okay, Blackbeard, these kind of items that you keep finding, do you want to explain that at all? And he's like, I would love to explain this little cache that I'm going to slip you right here and how that's going to explain. Well, I'm not going to have to explain anything.
Yeah.
And the governor of North Carolina was like, all right. So he was all down. He was all down with it, or specifically of Bath. And so, meanwhile, Blackbeard is continuing his exploits. And one of his favorite things to do was to actually go into the rivers kind of on the coast. You know, like the coast of North Carolina and kind of Virginia kind of neighbor each other, right? Sure. And so he's going through some of these coastal
inlets,
lands.
Yeah.
He had this really fun thing that he would do where he would go up to that area. There were a lot of plantations along that area, and you had a lot of sloops that would go back and forth and trade. And they were easy money. So he would raid these sloops. When things got too hot, he would do this awesome thing where he would go to the plantations and he would basically take all of the plantation owners and make them serve him. Which was fantastic.
Wow.
And they're like, well, you can't do this. You can't just come into our home and our land and force us to do your bidding without pay. That's our thing. That's what we do. You know, it's like this creates this massive turmoil. And again, the civilized world is kind of turned topsy-turvy.
Right.
I'm a plantation owner. You can't force me to work against my will. It's like, oh, does that bother you? Do you feel that that's something wrong about that? Of course there's something wrong about that. Does it cause you to reevaluate some of your life decisions? It's like, no.
I wouldn't.
So Virginia gets a little ticked off that North Carolina is kind of allowing this to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's kind of some pressure of hey, North Carolina, you want to deal with Blackbeard? They're like, no, Blackbeard's fine. Oh, by the way, North Carolina, governor of North Carolina, what's all this sugar and stuff? Where'd that come from? It's like, don't worry about it. It's we just found it. We just found it.
Kind of hanging out.
Yeah, we just found it. So anyway, finally, Virginia and kind of the lieutenant governor there is like, okay, fine. You know what? Y'all aren't going to deal with them. I'm going to deal with them. He amasses one of the largest hunting fleets to go after Blackbeard.
Wow.
And in November 22nd, 1718, they catch him. And I'm going to butcher this name, but off the Isle of Aquacoke. It's about the best I could.
Hey, sounds great.
Yeah, I literally wrote it phonetically of aqua coke, like aqua water coke.
OCRACOKE.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, Blackbeard is totally outmatched, 3 men to 1. But at the same time, they go out fighting, guns a-blazing. And it is reported that on his body, they found 20 sword slashes and 5 bullets. Blackbeard did not go down without a tremendous fight. He famously, his head was cut off of his body after the exchange, and it was hung off the side of the ship that took him out as they sailed back into port,
back into the harbor,
communicating to everybody that the devil was dead.
Wow.
Now, so a couple of things here, right? Blackbeard is referred to Blackbeard because of his black beard. He literally had this large, mane of a beard.
Yeah.
That identified him, right? He would also take, what do you call those things? A flint and put it inside of his beard, light it on fire, and have kind of a smoky kind of eeriness that was constantly
smoldering. Yeah. Again, he was very aware of his image and story and brand.
He was big on intimidation was his main weapon. And yet at the same time, he was known to be decked out as well. He had like 6 or 7 pistols on either side strapped to him. He was a walking fortress in and of himself. The Queen Anne's Revenge, being this floating fortress, was almost like this vessel that embodied who he himself also was embodied, right? Like he was just constantly, gunned up and ready to go at any given time.
Bristling with power, indestructible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it just kind of adds to that imagery. His Jolly Roger, his flag, was of this kind of skeletal devil figure that is piercing a heart, toasting with an hourglass saying that your time is up. Like he wanted to communicate instantly.
Don't mess with me.
Don't mess with Blackbeard. And as we mentioned, he does go out fighting pretty hard.
Yeah.
So here's the thing, as we kind of evaluate Blackbeard as a whole and this tension that exists, because he did communicate this like beastly energy, right? Like that was something he perpetuated. But at the same time, when we see kind of the ferocity and the fear, we do see that happening at seas, but it was only after he really started disrupting the establishment, right?
Yeah.
Which again,
Yeah.
the injustices of the days. The plantation owners were not heroes in this situation. They were in fact villains themselves, right? But they were sanctioned villains. They were like civilized villains, right? Whereas the quote unquote civilized villain of Steve Bonnet was like put to death when the civilized villains of these plantation
They're
owners
getting away with this
were
stuff.
threatened. That's when it's like, well, we have to put a stop to this and we have to destroy Blackbeard.
Wow.
And so I find it very interesting that these two worlds come like both collide in this moment, which like creates this overwhelming aggression towards Blackbeard to take him out. And at the same time, they're also kind of embodied with this individual who was part of his crew in Steve Bonnet.
Pot meet kettle, you know. Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, Blackbeard.
Wow.
Edward Teach.
Man, obviously, you know, we, again, as we discussed at the beginning of the show, we've all heard of this individual. The significance of him, you know, I think for a lot of us is just kind of lost without, you know, engaging it. And I'm so glad we got to. It's really, really great. And golly, what an interesting figure. And I look forward to reading more about him and also, you know, kind of learning more about like how the modern view of him is perceived, you know, like as research is done and all this, like, you know, what is the modern, you know, understanding of him? That's great. Well done.